Hello, my name's Mr. Guiney and I'm a teacher of history, and I'm going to talk you through today some of the causes of the February Revolution in 1917 and why the Tsar was brought down and the 300-year Romanov dynasty came to an end. Well, first up, we've learnt in our history class about long-term divisions in society. First of all, Russia was a very diverse people. There were lots of different nationalities, Ukrainians, Poles, Latvians, Lithuanians, all across this huge empire. And so it was very hard to unite a people who were so diverse. A man called von Plehve had famously tried to Russify or make everyone kind of the same. And this angered a lot of people who preferred their own traditions and their own foods and so on and so forth. And also particularly pogroms, anti-Jewish massacres such as the one at Kishinev still occasionally flared up in the countryside, and this caused lots of people to feel angry with the regime that sponsored this terror, and that was the Tsar. Also, though, another long-term division in society came back because of industrialization. Russia in the 19th century had been expanding rapidly, just like Britain and Germany had done previously. And this meant people were moving to the big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they were living close together in cramped, often terrible conditions. And because you're closer together, this meant you could talk more and spread more gossip. So revolutionary ideas such as Marxism started to be much easier to spread around the place. Remember, these cities had grown and the population increased fourfold in the 19th century to 150 million Russians. We know as well that Russian society had famously been described in a famous SR poster as a wedding cake. There were lots of people at the bottom, the proletariat, who felt they were being taken advantage of by the system. But in the country, we also had the peasant situation. Peasants were becoming increasingly literate, so they also could read information and propaganda, such as Lenin's 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done? And these peasants, who made up 80% of the population at the turn of the century, remained extremely poor. Even though the Edict of Emancipation had freed them from being serfs or slaves, they were still subject to 49-year redemption payments, and so they didn't have much movement. They were tied to the land or the mir. So there were lots of reasons in the cities and in the country in the long term why Russians weren't happy. That's the first point to note. Also, though, in the long term, we need to look at political mistakes. We know from our history class that there was a revolution in 1905, and in a strange way, this was an opportunity for the Tsar to kind of change and to head more down a road to democracy than a road to revolution. But Tsar Nicholas never really wanted democracy, and even after he was forced to publish the October Manifesto, which amongst other things gave freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, as well as a Duma or parliament, he didn't really allow for freely elected democracy and much change at all. Instead, the Dumas were known as a Duma of lords and lackeys. And remember, he followed this up with the fundamental laws in April 1906, which said, even though he'd effectively tried to placate the crowds who'd revolted in 1905 with the Duma, he said in the fundamental laws that supreme autocratic power belongs to the Emperor of all Russia, in Article 1. And in Article 87, he said he could rule by emergency decree. So he was kind of backtracking on the October Manifesto very quickly. People also remember the events of 1905, and the Tsar lost a lot of confidence after 1905 from his people. The massacre of Bloody Sunday on the 9th of January 1905, when Tsarist troops were fired upon a peaceful unarmed crowd led by Father Georgy Gapon. Also the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, where soldiers were served rotten meat with maggots in, as Eisenstein famously showed in his groundbreaking movie. Also the embarrassing short Russo-Japanese War, the first time a European power had lost in war to an Asian nation, as well as the strikes, which ended up being everywhere but started at the Putilov Steelworks, were all reasons in the long term why we could say there were political mistakes in 1905 that contribute to a loss of confidence. The Tsar had ruled by force, especially during the reign of the Prime Minister Peter Stolypin, and through the Okhrana, the secret police. And as historian Richard Pipes has said, the incompatibility of capitalism and autocracy struck all who gave thought to the matter. In other words, Russia was becoming industrialized like the West, but not democratic like the West. So it was changing in terms of its industry, but it refused to change, and the Tsar was very stubborn politically. So the last words on this slide are, "I have a constitution in my hand, but in my heart I spit on it," said Nicholas II, who Lenin famously, jokingly called Nicholas the Last. So, as well as long-term divisions in society, the Tsar made plenty of long-term political mistakes. But in the short term, there were other reasons, which included Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, who we've also studied. And we know that when the Tsar made the decision to become commander-in-chief in the spring of 1915, this left the Siberian peasant, the mujik, at home in the Winter Palace with the German-born Tsarina Alexandra, who was often accused of being a spy. And because of Rasputin's debauched antics, many rumours went around suggesting that she was under his control and that he was sleeping with both her and, of course, the Tsar's daughters as well. So very salacious gossip. And this links back to 1905 because the press were granted greater freedoms. Many also believed Rasputin was making important decisions about government and hiring and firing ministers. In 17 months, Russia had 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 3 foreign ministers, 3 war ministers, 3 ministers of transport, and 4 ministers of agriculture. And this was known as ministerial leapfrog. So again, the idea that a kind of uncouth peasant could be making decisions which affect the Grand Empire of Russia was hard for many Russians to swallow, even if it wasn't true. Like I say, there were lots of gossip and lots of rumours about Rasputin. I'm sure some of which were true, but he was never any evidence found to say he was a member of the Klisti, this sexual obsessed cult, and their spiritual beer that they used to enjoy, where they would swing round and round until they were almost kind of drunk with dizziness. We do know that Rasputin's reputation was damaged by a man called Bishop Ilyador, who wrote, I think for $25,000 an article called The Mad Monk. And we also know Yusupov, the man who killed him, almost certainly lied about his death to make Rasputin seem like a devil. But nevertheless, whatever Rasputin was really like, what we do know is that many Russians thought he was this devil destroying Russia from within, even though obviously he could control the Tsarevich Alexei's haemophilia. So this Straniki was definitely a short-term cause of the February Revolution. But also, a really huge reason was the First World War and the military failure of Russia in this war. So Russia had survived the embarrassing short Russo-Japanese War, but the government was not to survive a very long, drawn-out, disastrous First World War. So in August 1914, Russians had been supportive of the war, but they had some terrible early defeats, such as the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. And also there was a famous offensive called the Brusilov Offensive in 1916, which ultimately failed. So support for the war had dampened considerably. As we've said, it was much longer than the short Russo-Japanese War, and 17 million rubles had been spent on the war in just 3 years. There are stories of Russian soldiers on skis and on camels because they didn't have enough horses. But one of the biggest issues was there simply were not enough rifles. So there were 4.7 million rifles for an army of 6.5 million men. And there was a munitions crisis. And people simply don't win wars if they don't have enough bullets. So desertion was estimated to be around 34,000 per month. Officers were poorly trained. The head of the army initially was the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, who was basically given the job because he was related to the Tsar. Mutinies sprang up, there was war weariness, and nearly 37 million Russians had been conscripted by 1917. They were often badly trained, and many of them were farmers, and this meant leaving the crop not to be harvested and so on. But importantly, in the summer of 1915, the Tsar made the fateful decision to appoint himself commander-in-chief of the army. And this meant, rather than having the divine right to rule and blaming it on other people or Rasputin and so on, suddenly all the responsibility for Russia's military defeats landed firmly with him. And even General Brusilov himself had commented on the Tsar's weakness and unsuitability to lead. On top of this, in the short term, there were issues at home, which linked to the war in many respects. There was a famine taking place in the countryside. 15 million men had been taken from the countryside, and it wasn't just men, but also horses had been requisitioned for the war effort. So this decrease in the rural workforce meant there were real food shortages, and of course the army would be fed before civilians. Inflation was at 200%. Goods were costing more and more. There were bread riots taking place, and whilst in 1914 10,000 people had striked, by 1917 this figure was almost 900,000. Food was rationed, and people weren't happy at home. So there were many socio-economic problems. Nicholas decided to ban alcohol, which sounds like a good idea in the time of war, less drunk soldiers, etc. But actually, this meant a huge reduction in taxation by 30%. Revolutionary propaganda from groups like the Bolsheviks started to find a ready ear among the soldiers and workers, and there were long queues everywhere. Not only that, Germany had been Russia's main trading partner before the war. That obviously dried up trade a lot, and then when Turkey joined in, this meant vital imports were disrupted, so Russia struggled to provide clothing and footwear, and they couldn't import things very easily. So that's a brief overview of the causes, both long and short term, of the February Revolution of 1917.